Working at the shelter often felt like banging one's head against the proverbial wall. And while gaps in services made the work frustrating, the knowledge that better approaches do actually exist in other communities just amplified the frustration for me. One of those better approaches is using a housing first model to begin stabilizing hemorrhaging systems and the desperate people being chewed up by them. So, what's housing first? It's a crazy concept that a roof over one's head must be the first step on the path to recovery. The controversial part of housing first is the notion of wet housing, or, in layman's terms, a safe place for people actively using drugs and/or alcohol. To help make the argument that this kind of low-threshold housing is needed, one of the most effective angles I took, especially if I sensed any skepticism in the audience, was the fiscally conservative one. Instead of trying to shame or otherwise emotionally manipulate someone into supporting the idea of a wet shelter by telling heart-wrenching horror stories, I referenced financial results, like what they saved in Albuquerque after just 1 year of implementing a Housing First program. A chronic alcoholic without housing can run up staggering bills when you add it all up. Some of you may have heard about $1 Million Murray in Nevada. Well, we have our Murrays in Missoula as well, and the impact they have on overburdened systems and first responder morale is significant. So why doesn't Missoula have a housing first approach to ending homelessness? For me, that is a thorny question to answer. There was an attempt to provide a stopgap program for shelter-resistant individuals, spearheaded by the shelter I worked at, but it was not successful. The space, procured by then executive director, was a basement space in the First Baptist Church. It was named after Forrest Clay Salcido, a homeless man violently beaten to death by 2 high school kids in 2007 on the California Street Bridge. The Salcido Drop-In Center failed for a couple of reasons. The first problem was limiting access to the space to daytime hours. Any legitimate alternative to the revolving door between our local ERs and the county jail must be 24 hours to be effective. This point was emphasized by a police officer during a mental health first aid training I attended. When given a breakdown of all the available resources for someone with a mental health crisis, the officer asked what was available at 3 o'clock in the morning besides the ER and the jail. There weren't really any good answers. The second problem was a lack of services. Knowing what I know now, reading this little blurb from a 2008 Missoulian article makes me shake my head. Here it is. Christian Hughes, the new center's program director and a licensed addiction counselor, said the Salcido Drop-In Center will offer a variety of services to Missoula's diverse homeless community, including classes on financial management, computer literacy, job skills, housing, and nutrition, she said. Those courses will be taught by several volunteers of the AmeriCorps Vista program. The quote-unquote variety of services I personally witnessed did not match what was advertised in the article, and the first director of the program, to put it nicely, was not up to the task. The second director, though, she was awesome and did what she could with the available resources. Ultimately, the cost of leasing the church's basement space and the cost of providing staffing was not sustainable. And the unstructured environment inside the basement space was often difficult to manage for the young, inexperienced staff, myself being one of them. So the experiment failed. The executive director to the shelter left to start her political career, and 5 years later, the idea of a 24-hour wet shelter alternative to the ER and jail is still just that, an idea. The University of Montana's newspaper, The Kaiman, recently brought some much-needed attention to the lack of progress on this critical front, citing the need for these services as a major recommendation of Missoula's 10-year plan to end homelessness, which was drafted in 2012. Here's the conclusion of that op-ed. Much like abstinence-only sex education, an abstinence-based approach to alcohol abuse among homeless populations is entirely ineffective. It has been proven that the opposite approach is much more effective. Benoit Denizet-Lewis reported in the New York Times in 2011 that a study conducted by the University of Washington showed wet shelters end up costing taxpayers significantly less money. This is largely due to homeless addicts spending time in hospitals or jails as an alternative to housing. Psychology Today also reported in 2009 that wet shelters encourage reduced consumption of alcohol. Harm reduction is not a foolproof approach, but it is incredibly naive to think of addiction as a problem that can be solved through punitive means. Missoula should put serious, concerted effort into creating a wet shelter, we should not be allowing homeless people to freeze to death in alleyways because of their struggles with addiction. Rather, we should think of housing as what it is, a basic human right, not just one for the sober. Op-eds are great, but what is the real nitty-gritty of this perpetual failure to close this gap? Let me tell you 2 stories. Here's the first one. I had to extract a client on a bender from a motel. He was on oxygen and would die a few months later. In the triage room, he expressed what we call suicidal ideations. That means the ER had to hold him until a mental health professional could assess him, but the catch was his boozy blood had to be below 0.08. I sat with him while they ran the test. After an hour of trying to keep him from drunkenly getting off the gurney, and at one point having to hold a container for him to urinate in, I was more than ready to let the nurse take over. When I finally found the nurse and asked her what his BAC was, she told me it was 0.42. When I asked how long it would be before he could be assessed, she let out a cynical little chuckle and just said, at least 20 hours. The second story is a bit longer and starts one cold winter evening near the end of my workday. I decided to deliver some food to a client who had lost services at our shelter for sneaking in a bottle of alcohol. This man's alcoholism, combined with health issues, had resulted in both legs being amputated. He went from a skilled nursing facility, where he was kicked out for violating their smoking policy, to the shelter, then finally to the motel. When I arrived on bike, the police were there forcibly evicting him from his motel room. He had apparently gotten drunk and started throwing things against the wall, and the family living in the room next to him called the cops. The police on the scene were surprisingly quick to let me take over when I explained my role as a service provider. It was my hope that his one family connection in town, an ex-wife, could help fund a different motel room until the next day when he could get more money from the legally appointed payee who tried and tried to keep him from drinking his disability check away too quickly. But he couldn't find the number in either of the bloated plastic bags he got from his last discharge from the hospital. The only thing I could think to do was help push him in his wheelchair to the hospital. He tried to object, claiming they were going to have him trespassed, but I insisted. While I pushed him, he took sad, impotent little swings at me while demanding I either push him into traffic or the river. I told him to make sure he said that in front of the nurse when we got to the ER. We didn't get into the ER that night. The security guard met us on the sidewalk. We had a good conversation about the cruel absurdity of the whole situation, then he agreed to call the police. The officer who arrived was great and agreed to take the legless alcoholic client to jail for trespassing. The officer openly acknowledged that this was an inappropriate use of the jail, but that sometimes there was nothing else to do. I would suspect that this client had had multiple 911 calls that day. I have heard of frequent flyers, as they are oftentimes referred to as, getting as many as 10 calls in a 24-hour period. Those are just 2 stories. I have dozens and dozens more. They all highlight how expensive the gaps are and how the very real human costs on both clients and those on the ground dealing with these chronic systemic emergencies in a visceral way become too much to deal with. For those providing services, it's burnout from all the vicarious trauma. For the clients, I can only imagine it must be a living hell. There are still good people working to close the gaps, but it's an uphill battle. Who will fund this wet shelter? Where is it going to be housed? Is there the political will and community support to see it through? My frustrations at political symbolism in the guise of Missoula's gun ordinance, and now the new housing competition that's being created by the efforts to relocate hundreds of refugees into this mountain town, is directly proportional to the lack of urgency on this issue that I lived and breathed and sometimes wept over for the last 8 years. The recent media attention over Missoula's efforts to save refugees all started when some moms saw a horrific picture of a dead toddler washed up on the beach. And I get it. Images can be emotionally gut-wrenching, inspiring people to action. So let me end with some images. This one is a rotting foot from frostbite. I took it because the client refused to leave the motel room he had paid over $200 to stay in for a week in order to go to the hospital. So I wanted to at least take a picture and show it to a medical professional to get their opinion on whether or not I should ignore the client's wishes and just call 911 myself. He ended up eventually allowing me to take him to the hospital where half his foot was amputated. I don't know what the cost of the surgery, the month in the hospital, or the aftercare amounted to, but I speculate it probably would have been enough to cover at least 1 or 2 semesters of college. Maybe 1 or 2 years. This one is a colored pencil drawing left behind at one of the campsites I helped clean up a few weeks ago, covered in the first video of this series. For an update on that situation, I went back to the area 10 days later and saw tents up at 3 separate locations. I initially thought this picture was done by a kid, but my friend and former colleague, who knows some of the people in the area, thought it was the hand of an adult with the cognitive functioning of a 10-year-old. And finally, there's this one. This is a picture of the legless alcoholic as a kid. This picture helped me finish up the last few months at the shelter. I was so burned out and reactionary from the stress of being assaulted and having a knife pulled on me. It was difficult for me to see the people behind the problems we were all drowning in. Jay, not his real name, is dead now. His suffering is over. But if we can't get this done, if we can't close this gap, this community will continue wasting shit tons of money and torturing people because they are addicts. So let's wake the fuck up from this nightmare of criminalizing addiction and mental illness and get serious. Get serious about closing the gaps in our own backyard before we go out and try and save the rest of the world.